Good morning. Welcome back to this morning's Learning Collective sessions. We're really excited to have another edition this week with great presenters. We just had Dr. Jen Murphy this morning having a conversation with our own Duncan Welder about how to measure outcomes for your investments. And right now, we are currently starting this session with Dr. Ray Jimenez, who is a well-known name and a subject matter expert in the L&D industry as well. And Ray has spent the last probably 15 plus years with Cooper's Library and many other major companies in the areas of management consulting and implementation of learning technology solutions. You may have seen him speaking and presenting at e-learning guild shows as well as ATD conferences and shows in the past. And we were so saddened to not be able to have Learning Solutions this year. And we are so excited to have Ray Jimenez here sharing his knowledge and insights on what he would have shared at Learning Solutions and other conferences this year. I hope that you are well and safe. And then also, if you're not familiar, Ray is also the Chief Learning Officer of Vignettes Learning and the architect of Training Magazine Network. And I'll make sure to include the URLs for both sites in the comments below so that you're able to connect with both organizations that Ray is affiliated with. And then without further ado, I'm going to pull up your presentation here and we are going to get started talking about digital disruptions and really how to scale for the future in L&D and how and where to start, because it seems like many organizations know that they need to have some type of digital strategy in place, but are challenged with how and where to start. And I know you are going to answer those questions for them today.
Terrific. Well, thanks, Anne, for the wonderful welcome. And I'm very excited to be in the session today. So when you're looking at the issue of digital disruption, so a lot of things are going on right now. So let me jump into this presentation. And if you have any questions in the live chat, say hello to me so that I know you're there. If you have a comment, feel free to do that. We can have a conversation if there's one over there. If not, we'll continue with our presentations and an example today. So welcome to our session. So, just about 2 months ago, we were so busy with a lot of buzz with technology like AR, VR, conferences. We were ready to go to learning solutions, and so many things are going on. And yet, suddenly, we begin to realize that this was normal, when we can get together in a conference and have exchange ideas, be talking to each other. Today, this is normal. And I hope all of you are well and safe and are energetic and enthusiastic about life despite our conditions. But it poses some challenges to us. So this was normal, meaning to say we could have a conference, have a face-to-face, and have fine dining, which is I'm starting to miss. But now this is normal. Normal to us is we're talking to this extreme. We're talking to our conversations with Zoom, WebEx, and many other technologies and the like. Now, I've spoken to a lot of people and wonder what is going on in their minds as we see this. So one of the biggest questions I always have is that what are we learning from this current pandemic or crisis from an L&D world? And I'm sure that there are many of this. If you are in the chat, let me know your thoughts on this one. One of the most important things that we begin to realize was that there are always sudden changes. There are always unpredictable conditions. Now, we seem to know this, but we're not always thinking of this because just like anything else, we're not ready for anything until it happens, right? So you're familiar with the book Black Swan. And the author was talking about people don't pay attention to unknowns. They suffer severe consequences. This is quite interesting because in the workplace, we have the same situation whereby we're familiar with a lot of skills, familiar with a lot of things to do in our jobs. But really, in reality, we're always having a lot of issues that aren't unknown. So I call this in my own way the difference between the happy incidents and the unhappy incidents. Now, I got this from Ryan Surratt, who's an L&D director, and he told me that most of the time in L&D, we focus on the standards. We don't talk about the exceptions. We focus on the predictable, what's clear, static, easier, basic, and what is safe. and yet we don't address the unpredictable, the unclear, the changes, the harder things to do, wider and riskier. What does this mean? If you look at a typical e-learning course or a classroom course, you begin to see that there's a lot of emphasis in the area of you need to follow the perfect steps. Follow 10 steps, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What if something happens along the way? Go figure it out. We don't really spend the time talking to participants about the unpredictable part of it. And yet, in reality, you and I know that when you go to work, things are not necessarily the same the way the procedures are done. A good story about this was that I had a client that the people are complaining the same set of software. You go to one building, they're using the software in a different way. You go to another building, they're using the software in a different way, and it's the same software. So now, how do you train people when there's this variability, unpredictability? So this is kind of an interesting thing that calls our attention today, especially this kind of unknown, unpredictable environment. So before we get interrupted, we're already into this big the conversation about the industry 4.0, whereby everything is in robotics. It's a lot of 3D printing, a lot of Internet of Things, AI. We're excited about this. Today, though, we're sort of stopped a little bit and say, what is going on in here and where's the place of this technology? Very interestingly is that this already happened today. We have them today. Like, today even more. I was talking to my wife last night. I said, what do we do for food? Go Uber Eats or you go the other delivery, and many of the stores, even Best Buys, now find delivery as a mechanism. Everybody's latching into the part of enablement, the technology that we can get to what we want. So this is not just happening as a theory, it is happening in our way of life today, especially today. McKinsey made a very interesting study because of this rapid technology growth, right? The average life of a task is 2 years. Can you imagine that? And maybe you can see this. A lot of people, if you compare it like 10 years ago, it will take them 5 years to move into another job. Today, after 6 months to 1 year, somebody moves to another job, right? What is happening is that it's changing so fast, it really allows us very small opportunity, and it demands what they call more thinking skills, basically, in the learning rather than the skills. Now, this is kind of an argument, of course, skills based learning or thinking skills. So, but just this McKinsey study makes us ponder on this area. Another study, of course, with Deloitte was saying that companies rapidly adopting new push to move learning and training closer to work. Now, why is this has suddenly become an issue? I think there's a hidden part in all of us that we somehow know that many of the training programs we have are not necessarily hitting the ground. Meaning to say, you ask participants to come in, you develop a good training program, and then when they go back to work, most often we wonder how they're applying the ideas, and we are not as proud as we could claim that they're actually applying things. So one of the thoughts of Deloitte was that maybe the solution is to bring learning much closer to work for many other benefits, and we'll focus our conversation on that right now. That is what we're trying to push. So my experience tells me that I work with a company, with a client that has do body chassis frames for the Ford 150. And they were telling me that after 5 years of modernizing the factory, they have added 10 more production lines. They were fearing that they would lose people, but they end up realizing they're not actually losing people. They needed more people. But the one thing they realize is this, is that even if the robotics are working, they need people, frontline people, supervisors, to think about troubleshooting. They need to decide, they need to decipher, they need to act on it. So, aside from the skill of building the F 150 chassis, they need another kind of skill, the troubleshooting skill. And that's an interesting reflection as I do my adventure in this area. The second one experience I have was there was an oil refinery that was challenging their workers to just find another 1% more, another 1% more of reducing waste. And they said everybody's trained. We know what to do here. So we should be able to figure it out how to reduce 1 more percent. No avail. It was a very difficult task. And after some research and discussion with them, we discovered that the employees have difficulty thinking beyond what is known. So they have a task: one, two, three, four, five. It's done. It's good. Check, 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 check. Everything's okay. But if we ask them to do the 1%, to think a bit more than the usual and the regular thing, they're unable to do it. So this started really spinning my head after a few years and simply saying, so what is going on in this environment when people seem not to do beyond the skill or the expectations of a procedure? So another case, of course, this is financial situations. The millisecond decision making right now with all of the financial transactions are really so automated that the analyst must have a different analytical skills in order to get it done and in order to do stopgap, sell, make decisions. So it's no longer just technical, a skill set. It is also what you call a thinking skill set. So these stories made me challenge and think, what is going on and what do we do about this, especially from a perspective of designing, training, and developing in our L&D information. So here is John Hagel, and maybe many of you are familiar with him. I've been reading his book through the years and others as well. And he was saying that we need to scale beyond skills to thinking capacities. Now, this is interesting. Skills to thinking capacities. Now, one would think that when you develop skills, people are also thinking. He doesn't necessarily follow that way, according to them, because thinking skills is different. So he came up with this pyramid of learning pyramid. And he came up that where skills, there's knowledge. And he said that we are so driven to skills and knowledge. So we are, as an L&D community, we are instruction driven. We want to tell people what to do. And he said that's a real challenge because in unknown conditions, rapidly changing environment, people have no way of applying other thinking capabilities. So he was saying, why don't we start thinking about capabilities, capacities of people to go beyond it? Passion is something else. It's another element of it. But he says, let's move more than just knowledge and skills, but the capabilities. So he defines this as the capabilities part that is missing in the entire approaches today. So he calls it scaling, and I'm borrowing from John Hagel. And his scaling is the capacity to handle the exceptions and the unknown. I'm not talking theoretical in the terms of stock markets or pandemic, but I'm talking about even the very nature of day-to-day work. There's so many things that goes on that people stop just because it's not known. The common situation might be, why don't you do that? Or why did you stop doing it? He says, we don't know the answer. Or why did this product fell apart? Well, they didn't follow the procedures and we could not find the solution. So those are environments of the unknowns, the unexpected, that scaling would probably be able to address. So scaling, workflow learning, as we call this thing, has different three criteria. One is work is the natural place to learn. Second, going beyond content to using experience. And then thirdly, learning from trial and error and thinking through issues. Let's go delve down in this area. Work as a natural place to learn, beyond content to experience, and thirdly, learn from trial, error, and thinking through. So I wrote a book on this called Workflow Learning, and you can buy it lulu.com. Last year, I published a book. It's all about my experiences about workflow learning. You can also download, and I'll give you the link on that chat on that. You can download a free articles about 100 pages article on workflow learning. That way you can look at some of the essences of workflow learning. So take a look at that link in there so you can work on that. Where I'm really looking at is that work is the natural place to learn. When you say work is a natural place to learn, so I begin to research people and I asked mechanics, pilots, and others this question. So if you're facing in your own work situation, how are you learning? And I call this a really simple discovery for me, but it's a very profound discovery for me. Many of them are saying this particular area. And I'm going to use a story here from one of the mechanics that I work with. And he says, it's a broken screw. And he says, so when I'm trying to learn or trying to do my work, I try to recall my experience on the particular screw. And then he says, well, of course, then I tried it again and again. If it doesn't fit, and if it doesn't work, I still go check the specs of the document. I go to the documentation, see whether I'm using the right equipment and the other specifications. And then I check the equipment. If the equipment is broken and something's wrong with it. And then I also measured it. I do actual testing to make sure that it works. And finally, I would ask someone in the company. And then I call the supplier. Maybe it's the wrong part. So the worker would say, I do all of these things. And I do it all at the same time, doing this all at the same point that we're doing. So the common theme that I discovered is this. They are saying to me, I am able to figure it out. And this ability to figure out is a natural ability for people to actually solve problems while they're doing work. And the fascinating part about this is this: they're actually learning while they're doing work. They're actually learning while they're doing work. So while they're trying to fix, solve, and improve things, they're actually learning. So in this environment, they are actually learning. So let's come up with a little bit of a schematic and see whether we can draw some information in this area. You look at the scheme inside there. On the inner circle, you have two people working. And the first thing they would do at work, say they will diagnose and examine it. They would ask the questions, what's wrong with this thing? What would happen if you fix it? What would happen if we don't fix it? And what are the consequences and what are the benefits? What's wrong with this? So people are always asking this. On the second end, number two, then they look for solutions, answers, solutions. The answer might come from the person next to them. The answer might come from a reference. The answer might come from the logs or the history of the problem, or the answers might just come from a supplier. And many times it might come from a learning material that they have read before. But more often than not, as you would see in my earlier, later on presentations in some of the slides, the last thing that people do is to go back to the training materials. Isn't that funny? I mean, we train them, and then when they are now in the work situation, the last thing they will do is to go back. And I have plenty of stories to tell you about that, and I'll talk a bit more in a few minutes. The whole concept is that they're looking for answers, they're looking for solutions. And by the way, answers need not be content. Answers might be a system, a method, a particular approach, a technology. And then number three, they are constantly doing trial and error, excessive approximation. What does this mean? It means that whatever equipment, whatever problem, whatever ideas we might have, there's always a certain point when we are reflecting on whether it will work or not. Will I try it or not? How will I modify the approach or not? So this is now another behavior. And then finally, the person is always asking the question, did it work? Right? And where is the tweak, the problem that we need to do? And they cycle it back again. So I developed this construct to help me understand what is going in work. So this is a component where people are working all the time. At the same time, something is going on. So based on this construct, I've developed some models of how to approach this. So one of the biggest things that I have learned after researching and doing with clients is that traditional, you can notice it at the top level of this row, traditional learning, typical traditional learning, traditional is that we develop a course and it's event driven, like a goal, idea, exercise, and a test. Somehow we have very little influence on how they apply and the results. And it's like an event. It's like a one-time thing training program. Very, very linear. Very, very oriented in terms of you do this, period, right? When you're looking at capabilities, according to John Hagel, you're really looking at the dynamics. It's got to be carried. It's got to be constantly thinking. It's going to be constantly revolving and asking the learners and diagnosing the problem, finding a solution. Let's test it, do a trial and error, and then feedback and metrics. This is altogether doing. My research have shown me based on clients and of course other academicians and practical experts, that the more people think through a problem, the more likely you're going to apply it. The more they think through of a specific problem, the more likely they're going to apply it and the results. So this makes you begin to think that from a digital adoption, our learning design has been focused on content, on an event or instruction, has not been focused on the dynamic nature of learning and people while doing at work. People should be learning at work. How do we harness that? How do we use it as an opportunity to be able to accomplish and help our learners? So here is going back to the concept of the unexpected, the unhappy incidents, and the idea of the happy incidents. And again, when you reflect on this area, many of the problems with near misses in safety or high waste or poor delivery or poor customers handling, they all happen in the unpredictable and the exceptions. But this is where people need a lot more knowledge and thinking, but they cannot be trained. And this is a fascinating thing. That's the most difficult part to train. You can train skill by going through an A, B, C, D, and come up with a simulation, come up with a scenario. But the unpredictable, the exceptions, is hard to train on. It requires a thinking process. So I've spoken with some pilots on this, and so I asked them the questions: how do you actually figure this out? He says, well, we go through a lot of formal training, hundreds of hours, thousands of hours, depends on the kind of plane we're doing. So as we develop the manual, we could never really learn the manual. Always have to do something, either with test flight, either we go to a cockpit, either we're going to really do training and observe, or either we're going to go through a simulation. Why? Because we could not figure it out in how actually it works if we're not doing actual work. You cannot separate, therefore, and this is kind of interesting in my realization, you cannot separate learning from work, and work is learning. And the clue is that people are figuring it out. Which means that people are putting the idea that they should do and also the action that requires you doing, and therefore they're applying it, right? So that's it. So I've tested this concept over and over, and wrote a book on it with a medical issue, turning over ships. When they now have to turn over ships, there are many things that needs to be done. Record keeping is done, the checklist is done, but when it's turned over, not everything is there. There are questions that are hard to document and transfer. Now, what would a person do when he's in the receiving end, or when she is in the receiving end, the incoming shift? That's a real issue. They need to think through, they need to ask questions in order to really come up with an answer to that missing gap. We talk about call centers, the same thing, same problem. A lot of the issues. That's why you have when you call it, you scale the process. It's called support issues. But even in this basic and into the scaled process, they still have to ask the right questions so that they can help the customers and they can help their customers. Now, many of you probably have heard some of the folks who you call up in the telephone and call support, or even now worse, because talking about a chatbot. And when you ask a question, the answers comes from a script. And the problem is because the script is what's relied on, but there's no questioning, there's no thinking process as you move along. So people are figuring it out is an articulation of how people learn versus the typical L&D articulation that people are memorizing the content. It's two different points. Oh, did you memorize it? Will you recall it? Will you remember it? Right? Will you apply it? It is so driven by the content. Whereas on the other one, we figuring it out. It's driven by the problem, the solution that need to be fixed. So this is the good demarcation just to put in our brains. Going back to this model, therefore, just to reflect with this for the time being. There's a consequence to benefits, or answers and solutions. There are four parts to the benefits. So this is what you call the workflow diagnostic learning process. So going beyond to experience. So this is another element. So we just spoke about work. Learning must happen at work, and work is learning. Actually, you cannot separate it. And maybe the academicians, when you write books, we separate them, but in real life, it cannot be separated. They're not separated, they're always together. They are always embedded in what we do every day. So we need to figure out the way how to harness that. Second point is beyond content to experience. There's a story by John Silly Brown, who's the founder of one of the original thinkers at Park Xerox. He was telling a story about there was gathering scientists and technicians and engineers, on an equipment, a large equipment. They spend weeks figuring out what's the problem with this equipment. They couldn't figure it out. I remember I have a server problem right now. So it's the same thing. It's been like repeating. You test it. You buy all the equipment to test, and many of these things, and they couldn't figure it out. So one night, John Silly Brown went to the plant and looking at it, just pondering what is the real problem in here. After a couple of weeks, they haven't solved the problem. And then Peter, who was the janitor who maintains the floor and the equipment, was asking John, "Hey, John, so what's up? Why are you here?" And then John said, we couldn't figure it out. This thing doesn't work. This is the problem." So Peter said, "So what is the problem?" John was saying that something with the calibration, what is going on? And then Peter said, "Have you tried this setting?" And John did, "Let's try it." Boom, it worked. So now the question is that it worked. And then Peter was saying, "You know what? A few people would come to me, it doesn't work. I just calibrate that and it worked. Sometimes I didn't know exactly how I did calibrate it, but it worked." So the conclusion of John Silly Brown is that experience is so abundant in our workplace. It is so much a very important asset that is completely underutilized. And so when you're looking at workflow learning, when you're looking at this node thinking processes, experience therefore is one of the best ways to learn, but we cannot sort of handle it. We cannot sort of control it. We cannot sort of package it. And that's our problem with training. Because in L&D, we think of packaging things so that it can be consumed. A problem with experience is you cannot package. So what do you do with experience? How do you organize it? So one of the clients I worked with many years ago was Nexens. It's kind of one of the world's fiber optic company. And they were telling me that we train teams to think, okay, to how handle work issues. What they're saying is that they might have sophisticated technologies. I went to a plant that has like a big rim of huge roll of copper, and then when it goes out to the other end, it's like very tiny fiber optics. Instead of running 100 people in the plant, they only have 20 people running a huge plant. They always say that, yeah, the technology is there, the procedures are there, but 80% of our problem comes in when there's something wrong with the line and nobody can come in and think it through. So we train our people to think more than the fact that they do a lot of lessons on learning, but we want to make sure that they think. So if you follow Jane Hart, if you have not, please do so. She's a wonderful researcher, writer, and a really enlightening person to follow as a result. Every year she makes a study, and one of her studies right now is all about, this is last year, and she just did another one, I think this year. She interviews about 5,500 employees and asks them, how do you learn? What is your preference for learning? And you can see in the chart there, the highest, more preferred learning is number one, 95% is that daily work experiences is the highest. And then it's followed by knowledge sharing with your team. Now, this seems to be obvious to us. It's very commonsensical. This happens every day, and that's what we do. The lowest of all, like about 20, 10, 15% of preferred learning is classroom training and e-learning and conferences. Could you imagine that, right? Now, I'm sure there are reasons for us to love to go to conferences, but the general population says that we want to learn by experience and we want to learn by knowledge sharing. Just an insight. It's very interesting to follow Jane Hart. So when you're looking at that, therefore, this is probably the most profound thing I discovered by Harvard Business Review and written by Leonard and by Barton and Schwab. They said that experience is the fastest, the cheapest way to train people to prove answers that are not in formal learning. So now when you talk about exceptions, unpredictable areas, and then predictable areas, training programs are for a lot of predictable areas. But when you go to unpredictable areas, experience usually is the first thing. Have you noticed it when someone has a problem and an issue? What do? They call up the next person to them. They call up the boss, they call us their peers, they call up the next person to them. Why? Why don't they go to the performance support system? Or why don't they go to Google? Or why don't they go to the manual for the training programs? Or why don't they go to not go to the supplier first? Why? Because it is a question of reliable answers. The more you have a trusted people that you work with, you would know that they have thought through the process. Now, this is phenomenal because the value of contribution is important so that people know that if they have trusted relationship, they can rely on them. So how do we manage this? How do we explore this opportunity, and how do we even begin to take advantage of this reality in the workflow? So second component now, talk about work as a natural place to work, to learn. Secondly, idea of really trying to use experience. And then the third one is learning by trial and error and thinking. Now somebody of you will say, yay, we really cannot afford trial and error because there's too much risks. Well, trial and error without guidance and intelligence, of course, is risky, right? It's life, equipment will be destroyed. I'm not talking about that kind of reckless trial and error. Trial and error really follows a certain philosophy in here. So I like to use this illustration. And if you are in the chat, let me know if you have any questions and thoughts. When you're looking at trial and error, is in the process of really calculating risks. I always ask this question, right? Question is that, how do we learn best? Do we learn best by presenting solutions like 1, 2, and 3, very, very clear procedures, or we do trial and error? Often than not, that I've realized, maybe 80% would say trial and error and testing, and they're doing that. And some of them will simply say, well, not really. You need to do formal learning before you could do trial error and the like. I've been reflecting on this a lot. What is really happening is they really work hand in hand. But the fundamental thing is this: any knowledge, unless they are really tried and work, has no value as far as I'm concerned. You have a knowledge is floating all over the place. It's in our mind, it's in the books, everywhere. Knowledge is floating all over the place. But if they have not been tested, recalibrated, adjusted so that it can be used, it has no value. So trial and error, therefore, is a necessary process for learning. You cannot avoid that. You cannot, but in the formal learning structure in L&D, we diminish its value. We don't want to talk about it. We don't want our learners to be adventurous to go out on a track. So, important component here. So, Mr. Akoff here, Russell, wrote a book on the art of problem solving, and he was saying that trial and error is a process of calculating risks. So meaning to say, the more you do trial and error, the more you can succeed because you're testing it. And he talks about the triple loop experience learning, which is kind of very, very interesting. He says that if you want results, okay, if you take an action to the results, you have some certain assumptions, and those assumptions are driven by your context, where you're coming from. So, for example, if you're in the factory and you are the supplier, when you're looking at the results, you're looking at it from that particular vantage point. Triple loop learning means that if you get the result, it doesn't work, you go back to change your assumption or to check the context and then do another action. So it's a continuous process. Now, this is a fascinating component as far as learning design is concerned, or in the L&D, because this is so counterintuitive when you're looking at instructional learning, because in the instruction, we just want them to follow 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And even worse is when we test them whether they followed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Triple loop learning is not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It is a constant reflection of what did I do that did not work. So let me change my assumption, and then let me correct and let me understand the context of how I should do this. So it happens very, very quickly. So trial and error is a way of training oneself, to training the workers. So when I talk to the workers and the managers I interviewed, I always get the feeling that although they don't articulate it, that they're doing the word trial and error, they're actually testing it. They're prototyping it. They're doing a beta. They're coming up with a proof of concept. They're coming up with a minimum viable product concept. They're using many of these test modalities in order to make things happen. And that is a necessary part in terms of workflow learning, in terms of thinking in the process. So, for example, if you have standards And then suddenly there's a deviation. What do you do? How do you scale it? If there is no answer, how do you do it? So this is kind of a trial and error mentality. And now we're presented to some opportunities to see, well, how do we apply this concept? And I'd like to discuss a couple of examples in here. So in a nutshell, we're talking about work as the focus of learning, or work and learning happens together. That's number one. The second one, we spoke about making sure that we're using experience more than content per se, right? Drawing from a lot of experience. And then thirdly, we're using a constant process of trial and error, testing, prototyping, but having to this triple loop component. So one of the projects that I've been watching on the side, and by the way, this company got funding for $100 million last year because of what they discovered it to be. And I don't have a live example of it, but this is a good idea. So it's about coaching. They have about 10,000 coaches wired up in the entire technology to do that, but these are all mobile. So if you are a mentee or a coachee, that's properly called, your person who's being coached with a coach, and you need something, you do is ask a question directly in the smartphone. And if you need to have an immediate phone conversation, you go pick it up and you have a conversation. And now what you do is you have either FaceTime or Skype with it or other technology that you interact with that. So the instantaneousness of helping each other to solve a problem and then documenting it and had some follow-up information is phenomenal, because you collapse the old mentality of coaching. The other mentality of coaching, which works in some conditions, would be, let's set up a goal setting meeting. Let's come up with this inventory of what you want to do. Let's plan, let's do action item, and let's meet next week. Right? Okay. Well, that's great. That's another way of doing things. But this technology really quickly collapses the process. It collapses the work to do. Why? Because it's important for people to be doing work and need the coaching. They don't need a coaching more than the work, so they have to fix something in the work, so they need coaching. So if a person has a problem, like, okay, by the way, I need to find a spare part for this, or by the way, I need how do I ask this employee to reform his performance, right? They can constantly ping a particular question, then they can talk to their coach, and right then and there, in a matter of minutes, they have the answer, and they get the plan, and they get it doing. So it collapses it. So the most important part of the system is that component. So when you're looking at this, therefore, I mean, you're looking at the screen here, somebody begin to a session, you come up with a session, come up with the notes, and then come up with the metrics in terms of how it's very, very short cycles, very, very fast. So it talks about work. It happens at work. It doesn't happen in a classroom. There's no classroom setting. There's no lecture. There's no session. There's no video lecturing you on how to improve yourself. It's all about the interaction of that moment, right? The second is trial and error, because if you don't get it right, you come back to the coach and said, I tried this, it doesn't work. And the coach could probably say, help you out. What are the options of doing this? And then finally, you would simply say, let's use experience, get the experience going, constantly try this until you solve the problem. So those three things happens all at the same time. So this company is a better app, and check it out. It's a huge company. And then again, it meets what I call the criteria of the thinking process, which is like, it works in work environment, it works relying on experience, and then it learns from trial and error and thinking through. So thinking through of the problem. The second project I wanted to share with you is Situation Expert, and I'm responsible for this product. Just wanted to show it to you. The process is this. It starts with a work situation. They put the customer, they put the participant or the employee into a work situation, and then they analyze the work situation. After analyzing the work situation, they come up with solutions to the work situation, and then they get resources, and then they report an impact. So again, the focus is the work situation. So let me see if I can pull up my screen in here, show you a couple of examples in this area. And okay, so here is the interface in here. It starts with a small, it's a video, it could be a tape, it could be a video, it could be an image and the like. And let me see if I can play this video a little bit louder from my end here. It should play it out. So very, very 30 seconds video.
Hey, Chase, I heard your brother-in-law was having some kind of electrical problem with his tractor.
Yeah, he's having something going on. We're not sure if it's going to be a battery, an alternator, or a starter, but I do know one thing. This tractor sitting here is costing him a lot of money, and he ain't making none. So we need to figure out what's going on. We need to go full electric.
Okay, so that's an example. And again, it can be an image. And the workers are the ones admitting this problem to a group. It doesn't have to be a big group. There's no formal structure, there's no formal training. So now the worker who's a problem would do that. Then the worker would do his own analysis of this thing. So if I go click in here, you can see there's a fishbone analysis. Many of you are familiar with this tool. So you go to the fishbone analysis, he or she would complete this. And then he can also see what other people are doing in their analysis using the fishbone. So now they're learning from each other, they're making comments with each other, which goes back to our point earlier that workflow learning is all about sharing experiences, practical, real life experiences, no instruction, but they're learning from each other as a result of this one. Then they're asked a solution. What is your solution? Oh, I came up with a checklist. I can come up with my checklist, and I skip on my doing my checklist. I can also see the checklist of what other people are doing, and then they can comment on my checklist and see how I can add to the checklist. So, what drives this primarily is work issue. It is not a training event. It is not a attend a class. It is not a see a micro video. It is not, no, none of those. It starts with what is the work issue that you want to do, and then you go to a thinking process. The third step here is that the system will ask people to rate kind of a gut feel assessment of where are the impacts, where are the impacts of what I'm doing. So there can either can be efficiency, savings, and the like, and they can make a comment. So because if they found a way to fix these structures, they must have a saving, it must have improved some efficiency, so they put it in. This is not meant to be a scientific method to measure accuracy of accounting in ROI, which we do in L&D. This is so anti L&D because this is an informal assessment of the person assessing himself. Now, you remember we talked about this in the workflow diagnostic process. In the workflow diagnostic process, people are also asking the question, did it work? So if the worker, the participant is in a work environment, he or she is always asking the question, did it work? Did I get the problem? Did I save time? Did I turn around the plane? Did I save the product and the waste is lower? Did I help the customer? They know that because that's the area. For me, this is the essence of this modality of learning, workflow learning. In the typical learning models, when we ask to test people because they memorize or they try to apply, we're looking for retention. And in many, many cases, that's very good. But it's very hard to claim that they really are impacting work. In workflow learning as an alternative model, it really says that you don't really want to care too much about the big picture, the ROI. Of course, the CPA and the CIO and the CEO would like to see those numbers, but what you're really concerned of is that are the learners and the workers constantly asking feedback and metrics for themselves. More important is, are they asking metrics for themselves? So here you go, you have their own metrics in this area and they get the results. Furthermore, they could select other tools. There are many other thinking tools that they can do, many tools, so that the library of their tools is not just one model. They can pick several other tools and models in order to think through. The essence of this primarily is to give the worker the ability to think into the process and then giving them tools. In traditional learning, what we do is we give them perfect answers. This is the 1 to 10. In performance support, this is the answer. In e-learning, in micro-learning, we're content-driven. We give them the answers that are in predictable environment. In workflow learning, in Better App and in Situation Expert, our assumption is that learners are thinking through the problems. So helping out in coming with the tools in order to think through the problem. So let me go back on that and we go back to my PowerPoint in here so that I can continue. And if you have any thoughts and questions, let me know in the chat. So the process is here. I showed you the example of the tractor. You can do this in customer care. We have a lot of clients in the customer care area because a lot of these issues are happening. And then it passes what I call the workflow learning, the scaling process. Our objective is to scale from skills to thinking capacity, right? Not that skills are not important, but please understand, I'm not saying that skills and knowledge are not important. They are knowledge, but the work has to come before skills, or before even work thinking has to come more in a more powerful way, because of that is the demand for the work condition. So work is natural place. Always start with work environment. It's very profound for me, because if you do training that starts with a theory, or even as designers, our estimated, our feeling of what might be correct, which we have all do a lot, learning objectives. Subject matter expert tell you these are the learning objectives and this is what you need to do. More often than not, when you go out to work, some of those things change. And how would the learner and the worker handle that? That is where the missing gap in many of this respect. So content rely on the ability to work on experience, and this model in here, like better app and situation expert, draws from the experiences of everyone. It's very powerful. And then they do trial and error. They test it, they analyze it, they review it, and then they report an impact component to this one. So in a nutshell, when you're talking about scaling, what we're really measuring is not memorization of content, but at the end of the day, we want to know if the workers are getting a big picture thinking. And there's a big discussion about this, the T model of learning. T means there are broader skill sets, the generalist versus the specialist, right? So more and more of our specialists are too narrowed and siloed. They have no ability to go beyond the multidisciplinary component. So when they are presented with another problem that they have not been exposed to, they are limited in the response. Discover hidden aspects, to discover the things that are not obvious, that are unpredictable. And this is what our current administration and our current governors and our medical people are trying to figure it out. What is going to happen? What is happening? This is a forever situation that we're in right now. Very good illustration. Build on reliable actions. If it worked, we work on it. We keep on building on it, and creates deeper knowledge. Deeper knowledge because you just don't know the answer. You also know how the answer was arrived at. And because you know how the answer was arrived at, when there's another environment, another situation, you can actually do thinking the same process and potentially get the right answer. So I made some research on this one, and not scientific. I did not publish a paper, but whenever we have a client, we collect information. This is what we discovered. Traditional training program has pretty low ability to help people in terms of big picture, in terms of discover hidden aspects, building reliable actions, and creates deeper knowledge. Now, I'm describing typical is that the lecture, the instruction, the telling of what to do, heavy on content, right? On the workflow learning, when you want people to think, discover things in the workflow, starting with work, and you experience, you end up with a lot higher ability to think in a bigger perspective, discover hidden areas, and build reliable actions, creates deeper knowledge. I often ponder that maybe it is not a fair comparison, or maybe it's not even appropriate a comparison that you compare traditional training from workflow learning, because they're measuring different two things. But since we don't have any other form of standardization and comparing, forgive me for taking this as a comparative view. Traditional learning is designed for a different thing. Workflow learning is designed for a different thing. But the beauty is that they could leverage each other, right? The beauty is that they could lay in top with each other. And more, I had a long interview with a couple of participants from a client's workshop yesterday. And more, I see expressions like, um, we are better than me. I'm going to repeat that. We are better than me, which means that if we work together collaboratively, share experience, my idea is better. My idea is less better than all of us together. And then another trainer said, I'm changing the nature of my work. Instead of a trainer designer, I'm going to be a problem solver. Okay, I'm going to be a problem solver. Now, why is it significant from my point of view? Is because now this trainer is looking at the worker's point of view rather than the training point of view. And then finally, a good insight was that one of the person was saying in that workshop, how about if I call them workers instead of participants or trainees. Because workers, when I call workers, suddenly it shifts my mindset. I'm understanding what they're doing at work rather than designing and training, whereby I would say, I'm going to design a content. Whereas workers, oh, what are they working on and how can we help them? So, kind of an interesting active things that we might want to do in ourselves. So again, look at the workflow review learning process here. And what we're trying to say is that there are ways to improve capabilities and capacities by understanding that there's a dynamic way that people are thinking things. And of course, check my book in here and then download this handout. So you can get about 100 page of articles that I've compiled for you as a result. So, and do we have any questions and answers so far? Do you have any thoughts that you want me to address before we wind up? Thank you.
I don't see any questions in the moment, but you brought up some really interesting points, and I was just thinking about how decades ago when I went into banking, we did what was called on-the-job training. That was how we were trained. It was automatically OJT is what they called it, and that's a term I haven't heard in a while as well. But this definitely reflects what you are saying about workflow learning and how you need to take it beyond the content. Sure, training content will help give you lay the groundwork, but you can't truly learn until you've had that experience, right?
Yep. Yep, and it's kind of an interesting approach because I had an experiment with a company, a computer company, and they were saying we're teaching people on server troubleshooting. So part of the class for half a day, about 20 people go to another room and says, "Okay, we're going to tell you how to troubleshoot." The other part which says, "Okay, this is the book, this is the server, troubleshoot." So the second group was very chaotic, right? But they concluded they learned better and faster and understood how to do things again. The first group, they passed the test, but when they were sent to resolve the problem, they couldn't figure it out. It took them another 2 to 3 days to figure it out. So it's kind of an interesting paradox that you mentioned over there. Thanks for bringing it up, Anne.
Oh, absolutely. And then one of the, again, went back to what you were saying about how you learn from experience at work. It's the challenge right now. And the skilled trades, say plumbing, welding, there are a lot of them who are retiring. And so how do you continue to train the upcoming welders or plumbers or whatnot without the experience from the older ones? How does that happen? Because yeah, sure, you can learn this in class, but there are always situations that arise that can only be addressed from an experience that a worker has had, right?
Right. Yeah. And that's always the challenge we have in the L&D world is that we are used to the telling. We are a telling industry. Well, not only our industry, but human nature has generally a telling ability. We want to tell. People don't learn by being told. We already know this. Right? We already know this. So now we're being challenged to see how else can you really push learners on that work experience. Okay. Good
Yeah.
observation. Thank you.
Absolutely. I love it. And we've included the link to your book on Lulu already, Workflow Learning. So we encourage everyone to go out to the website and grab a copy of the book. And then I'll make sure to include the link for the download to your article as well. That will be valuable to everyone. But this was a very insightful presentation today. I greatly enjoyed it. And if you were unable to catch the live broadcast, it will remain on our Facebook page and will also be available on our YouTube channel. And please feel free to drop in your comments or questions, and we will make sure to pass it along to Ray, and we'll get to any answers or additional insights that you'll need. And if you're not following Ray on Twitter, please do so. It's at Ray Jimenez. You are quite an active Twitter user, and so you'll be able to glean a lot of insights and knowledge from following Ray on Twitter as well. And again, thank you so much for your time and your generous sharing of your knowledge today.
Thank you so much, Anne. It's a pleasure, and thanks to the group, okay? Say hello to Duncan, okay? Bye-bye.
Absolutely. Bye-bye, everyone.
Okay, bye.